The Denver Broncos 53-man roster is coming very, very quickly into shape with the cutdown deadline of 2 p.m., just a little less than 2 hours away from right now. So with the flurry of transactions that we've seen around the NFL and here locally in the Mile High City, which position groups are feeling pretty deep and which are maybe feeling a little thin or at a minimum overlooked? All things to come on today's rundown, but I want to begin with a position group that I did not expect to be as quote unquote deep or certainly not as heavily favored as it has been, as it turns out. And that is the running back room, where it does appear with the transactions that have been made by waiving Audric Estime, the draft pick from the 5th round just a year ago, Blake Watson, who may or may not be receiving an injury settlement as a part of his dismissal from the team. And it now looks like you are going to carry 4 running backs on the 53-man roster if you're Sean Payton and George Payton. And those 4 are as follows: J.K. Dobbins and R.J. Harvey, the obvious 1-2 punch and presumed starters. And then sneaky kind of come from behind candidate Tyler Bidet, who has emerged on special teams and given himself a realistic vision to be the RB3 in Sean Payton's offense going into year 3, and the only remaining incumbent player from last year's running back room, Jaleel McLaughlin, who I'll be frankly honest, thought was not going to make this team. I thought it was going to be those first 3 names on that list, and that is all they would carry. But there's clearly been enough competition and enough shown by the likes of Tyler Bidet and Jaleel McLaughlin in a returning sense to show Sean Payton that he should justify enough the usability of each guy to keep all 4 and probably a fullback as Michael Burton works his way back from injury. And then you have, Adam Prentice in that situation going on there. So we will see how the final roster shakes out, but all signs are pointing toward there actually being 4 running backs on this Denver Broncos roster. And while that could in part be because of what I just mentioned with the level of competition and the talent level and the skill sets between the likes of a Tyler Bidet and Jaleel McLaughlin being distinguished enough to keep them both, especially when you add in Tyler Bidet's special teams factor and his pass protection capability. But let's not forget, one of the 2 lead backs for this Broncos offense has had a very difficult time in his NFL career staying healthy for a full 16 and now 17 game season, that obviously being J.K. Dobbins. And we know the magic and the voodoo work of Bo Lowry and his strength and conditioning staff and the way that medically they've been able to take the Broncos from one of the most oft-injured teams to one of the least injured teams. But there has to probably be some form of insurance policy for J.K. Dobbins' 2025 to look a lot like his 2024, 3, 2, and 1. And I think that keeping Tyler Bidet and Jaleel McLaughlin is a good way to combat against that. And then you look at the wide receiver room, where maybe a player of depth was sacrificed in order to keep 4 running backs on this roster, and that obviously being Devon Vele, who was traded to the Saints about a week ago. So now your wide receiver room almost certainly looks as follows: Courtland Sutton, your undisputed, unchallenged wide receiver 1, your wide receiver 2 from last season in Marvin Mims Jr., being the opposite boundary receiver for the most part during this offseason. And then Troy Franklin, the surging and emerging second-year player who I genuinely believe and have been on the record multiple times saying I think he has a wide receiver 2 campaign in front of him in this offense with Sean Payton and Bo Nix. The rookie in Pat Bryant, who does not look very rookie-like thus far and seems to have pretty sure hands. And as long as he continues to progress as a route runner and in the blocking game and continue to ingratiate himself within Sean Payton's offense, I think Pat Bryant and Troy Franklin represent a legitimate potential future window for the Denver Broncos as your wide receivers 1 and 2. And then, of course, Trent Sherfield Sr., the free agent acquisition, the veteran player coming over from Minnesota, who at first was billed as a special teams demon and someone who was going to replace Traymon Smith in that phase of the game, but has proven himself throughout training camp, joint practices, and in the preseason games to be a more than capable wide receiver at the NFL level. And so if that's going to be the wide receiver room with 5 wide receivers, where you might think they probably could have, especially with the talent of a guy like Devon Vele, who seemed to be emerging despite slightly having a health setback in this offseason. The names that don't make that list, that were cut, waived, and released from this roster, from Joaquin Davis to Courtney Jackson to Jerwan Newton to Kyrese Rowan to Michael Bandy, who seems to be in the middle of the same arc that he's in every year, where he goes out and makes plays in training camp and potentially in the preseason, but is never really a considered 53-man roster type of player. But even within those names, you would expect at least a handful of them to make it back on the practice squad. And I think that could be important, to have a Joaquin Davis and a Courtney Jackson who shined on special teams as well as being a receiver, and even Jerwan Newton, Kyrese Rowan, and Michael Bandy in some fashion, having those guys, because running 5 wide receivers leaves you pretty light if and when there's injury and or regression from any of the 5 in that room. And let's be honest, Troy Franklin and Pat Bryant have shown significant leaps and bounds, especially in Troy Franklin's case, year over year, and Pat Bryant coming into his rookie season, but they have yet to do anything in a real NFL game that counts. Because remember, that's the best way, I think, to look at the preseason, is that the games don't count, but they do matter. And so I think it has mattered. The evaluation of Troy Franklin and Pat Bryant has mattered in a sense that they felt confident with what they saw in training camp, joint practice, in the preseason games, to trade a guy like Devon Vele, who was the 3rd receiver in this offense last year, and somebody for a 7th-round pick making less than $1 million looked like a legitimate candidate to significantly outproduce what they're costing the Denver Broncos. But Troy Franklin and Pat Bryant's continued development and kind of mini breakout in the offseason gave Sean Payton and George Payton enough confidence to go shop that guy. But Troy Franklin hasn't done any of that on paper with Penn. He hasn't done it in a regular season game that counts. In fact, the body of work in the preseason or in the regular season from last year for Troy Franklin, not great, Bob. Just all in all, left a lot to be desired. And Pat Bryant, as much as he has looked like a steady-handed, savvy rookie wide receiver to step into this offense, there's still proof to be had there as well. And so having capable guys on the practice squad that can call up and move around if and when things do need to change, or if there is regression in that regard, could be important. I'm seeing on the screen here talking about Caleb Lohner, the experimental 7th-round draft pick who played very minimal college football at Utah. Will he make the 53-man roster? I don't think so. I think he is the perfect archetype, similar actually to a Joaquin Davis, of a guy that just, like, from a physical standpoint and a metric standpoint as a receiver, which is what Caleb Lohner would be. I don't think they're very interested in him as a blocking option at the tight end position. I think he presents a lot of covetable and intriguing qualities, but I just think it's too raw, and maybe Lohner more than Joaquin Davis in that regard. So I think that he profiles perfectly as a not to make the 53 guy, come back on the practice squad, assuming he clears waivers, which I think that he will, and then have Sean Payton and the staff be able to mold him throughout the course of the season, to where maybe on the back stretch of the season with a team that has a later bye week, you can bring him up during a dog days stretch and maybe mix things in that way. So no, I don't think Caleb Lohner makes the initial 53-man roster, but I do think that this coaching staff sees an intriguing proposition in him that Sean Payton, who is the ultimate molder and crafter, not just for quarterbacks, would like to see through a little bit more. And then you want to look at the inside linebacker room, right? That's another one to me that I think this position could be sneaky light on depth and maybe being overlooked in terms of the importance of having depth at that position. And that is the foursome, the projected foursome of Alex Singleton, Dre Greenlaw, Justin Sternad, and undrafted free agent Karene Reed. Now, the cool thing about Karene Reed being the 4th man in this 4-person room is that it maintains that 21 out of the last 22 seasons, an undrafted free agent has made the Denver Broncos 53-man roster. And that is just one of those quirky, interesting tidbits and facts that I find not just fascinating from a fact that it's happened that many times in a stretch. I mean, we're talking about Rocktober level efficiency, 21 out of 22. But it just goes to show that this team and this front office and this coaching staff for multiple decades have found ways to find diamonds in the rough, to find productive NFL caliber and quality players across a multitude of positions that everybody else, including, frankly, the Denver Broncos, passed on 5, 6, 7 times during a single draft process. I mean, the likes of a Chris Harris Jr. coming out and he's kind of the more recent poster child of that undrafted free agent. Philip Lindsay being an undrafted free agent to then kick the door down at the NFL level and rush for 1,000 yards and then become the first undrafted player in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards in consecutive seasons to start an NFL career. Chris Harris Jr. being a part of a no-fly zone Super Bowl champion defense and having just an unheralded blue chip mentality throughout his entire tenure here in Denver. Will Karene Reed be the next to reach that kind of level? I don't know. But the fact that he showed enough from a ball tracking ability and a heads-up savviness at the linebacker position, had a couple of interceptions, and showed that he can, at least in the eyes of a preseason lens, lend a hand in a room that genuinely, in my opinion, is going to need it over the course of a 17-game season, because we've already seen the 2 starting linebackers in that room, in Dre Greenlaw and Alex Singleton, who are both coming off of significant injuries in the very recent past, get nicked up again during this preseason. Dre Greenlaw with a quad issue, and Alex Singleton with a broken thumb. So I really believe that the Denver Broncos are going to have to lean more heavily on the depth players at inside linebacker, so the Justin Cernads and the Karene Reeds, than they would like to. And that seems to lend itself to want to say, hey, let's maybe stack some more depth in that room, even if we have to carry an extra body the way we did at the running back position. But that's not what they've done. They cut Lavelle Bailey in what I considered to be a relatively surprise cut, as somebody who, like Karene Reed, was seeming to show some flash and some potential in that regard. And if he clears waivers, I assume they'll want him back on the practice squad. But then Jordan Turner and Garrett Wallow, there's a lot of names in that inside linebacker room that they are electing to let go of in order to carry those 4. And then you'd assume Drew Sanders will come back when he is recovered from his foot injury. But I just feel a little apprehensive and nervous about that inside linebacker room with the health scares at both starting positions and the lack of, it appears, depth options in that room, which I think are going to have to play. There was even, in terms of depth and trying to cram 53 guys into a roster where you feel you have more than 53 in a quality depth, you're seeing the potential end of the line for guys like Damari Mathis in the cornerback room and Delaren Turner-Yell in the safety room. Again, just 2 players who probably have the ability to make 53-man rosters, as they've both done in the past at the NFL level. But when you're stacking the depth of talent in both of those areas, in the cornerback room where Chris Abrams-Drain is your 5th corner, and he's a capable corner in and of his own right, just stuck behind a first-round draft pick in Jahdae Barron, a slept-on slot corner in Jaquan McMillan, and then boundary corners like an emerging Riley Moss and the Defensive Player of the Year in Patrick Surtain, and in the safety room with Devon Key and Talanoa Hufanga and Brandon Jones and JL Skinner. There's just not enough room to keep all of these guys, and these are some of the tough cuts that Sean Payton was forecasting. I'm seeing here on the screen, who do you think the Broncos will keep on the 53-man roster? Well, without going through the entirety of the 53-man roster, which is probably what we'll do on tomorrow's show once it's been finalized after we get off the air today, I can tell you that I feel confident that they're not going to carry 3 quarterbacks. I don't think that with what you saw from Jarrett Stidham in the preseason, and he's obviously the backup to Bo Nix, that you need to keep a valuable roster spot to keep Sam Ehlinger on the roster, and he can go to the practice squad, and maybe he gets claimed by another team, maybe he doesn't. But with the quarterback mobility that's been going on lately, you're seeing Kenny Pickett get traded inside the division from the Browns to the Raiders here in the AFC West, and you're seeing movement at all these other positions. There's a lot of teams that are cutting their reserve quarterbacks. We saw the Buccaneers move on from Kyle Trask. The Giants just today released Tommy DeVito, who's now their QB4, to keep Jameis, Jackson Dart, and Russell Wilson on the roster. So I don't know that there's going to be this clamoring for a guy like Sam Ehlinger that they have to keep him on the 53-man roster. We went through the running back room with the 4 projections there. In the offensive line, they cut a guy that I thought had a good inside shot to make the 53, and Calvin Throckmorton. I thought that he had shown some flashes in the preseason thus far as a reserve tackle. And offensive line depth is something that the Broncos have not been challenged with in recent years. They've had very little to no injury of a significant capacity in the offensive line room for 2 consecutive years. Knock on whatever surface is nearest you that continues. But if it doesn't, we've seen how the offensive line from an injury and a depth perspective can become a revolving door. And I thought Calvin Throckmorton could have been a piece like that to fit in that Alex Palczewski kind of reserve option. And then Will Sherman, the former Buff, also gets cut as well. So I guess if you're looking at the offensive line outside of Alex Palczewski, and we saw Nick Gargiulo go down with the cuts that I just mentioned there, I think they're going to run relatively lean. I think, what is that, 8 bodies that they'll probably keep in the offensive line room, because if I would have said 9 if you included Throckmorton. The tight end room, looks like they're going to move Nate Atkins through to the 53-man roster, and not put him on IR, so that he might miss the first week or 2 of the regular season, but not have to miss any further than that, kind of beat that injured reserve clock. And then you're looking at the tight end room of Evan Ingram, Adam Troutman, and Lucas Kroll probably being the other 3, because I don't think they carry more than that. So that the likes of Caden Prieskorn, who's already been waived, Caleb Lohner, I assume, will follow that same path, and they'll try to get both of those guys back on the practice squad. And then on the defensive side of the ball, we've seen some interior defensive linemen get waived. I mentioned the linebacker names earlier with a safety and a corner. It is all kind of coming to shape. And I guess outside of maybe Lavelle Bailey and Calvin Throckmorton, there haven't been too many cuts that have been made made me kind of look back and go, whoa, hang on a second, because I thought that was going to happen to Audric Estime. So you can count that as a big cut, but it wasn't really a surprise cut to me. So to answer your question, which we'll go into more in detail in tomorrow's show when we have all the finalized rosters, I don't expect a ton more of cuts that will make us turn our heads and go, whoa, because they kind of got that already out of the way. They traded Devon Vele to carry 5 wide receivers. We kind of feel confident after releasing Audric Estime that they're going to run with 4 running backs on the roster and the roles that are defined there. I guess there could be guys that make the team that surprise me. Like if Caleb Lohner makes the 53-man roster in that room and it comes at the expense of another more experienced tight end, I guess I could be surprised there, but we will get into all of that on tomorrow's show. Let's do one more here. Caleb Lohner, Frank Crum, Alex Palczewski. Any reason you have these guys making the team? Palczewski, I do. Yeah, Alex Palczewski, I do. I think he is somebody that they value a lot. They call him Palcho, and he has what I think a lot of head coaches value when it comes to the offensive line, which is versatility. He can kind of be a plug-and-play tool at multiple positions along the offensive line, whether it's a swing tackle or playing multiple interior positions. Any guy that can fit multiple backup spots that allows you to keep a leaner room without sacrificing quality depth, I think is good. And Palczewski kind of fits that bill. I do not think Caleb Lohner makes the roster. I think that he is a developmental project and was drafted as such. Probably would have gone undrafted if the Broncos didn't draft him, and they could have maybe tried to sign him after the fact, but compete with 31 other teams to do so. So I don't think he will be on the 53-man roster, but I expect him to clear waivers and be back on the practice squad and be somebody that Sean Payton and that coaching staff continues to develop as we go forward. And then Frank Crum, your guess is as good as mine. They've got to keep a certain amount of bodies in that room. So I would say I could see it. Yeah, I could see it happening, especially because, they cut a guy like Calvin Throckmorton, who I thought they were going to keep on the 53. And so I think that if that roster spot goes to a guy like Frank Crum or somebody else in another position room, then, I could draw those parallels and those lines. So we will keep an eye on all things going as we've got 90 minutes or so before the finalization of the roster will be complete. The deadline that the NFL sets will have passed, and we will officially know, at least for now, how many players and which players at each position group will be headed into the 2025 season for the Denver Broncos, and thus begin the countdown clock to the Tennessee Titans and Cam Ward in week 1. Stay locked into Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan for all of the most up-to-date and latest information on all things Broncos off-season. Keep your eyes peeled at DenverSports.com for the likes of Andrew Mason and Trent Finnegan and Will Peterson and Jake Shapiro, who are breaking down in detail and at length all of the moves for every different angle that we can be approaching as the regular season for the NFL is on our doorstep. And lock into all of our social media channels here, like YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, for all of our digital content, digital shows, from clips of our radio programs to digital shows like this on the Rundown and Denver Sports Daily. And we are just on the doorstep of having some of our hoops and hockey podcasts back up and running at full speed. So anywhere you have content that you want to pursue and consume, we have it there for you. So keep it locked, and we will catch you tomorrow at noon.
I do what I love what I do. Second nature to put in the work.